in today's themes and conversations. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the medium we have this morning, you can't see each other, you can't communicate with each other. We have the power here and promise to use it as justly and fairly as we can in moderating the questions and putting them to Deputy Murphy and ensuring a good conversation after her opening address. Just want to say that this is part of a series with policymakers and political leaders coming after conversations with the leader of the Green Party, Eamon Ryan, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, and Minister for Public Expenditure, Micheál McGrath. It comes in the 20th anniversary of TASC, so we've lots to, I think, celebrate this year and lots to reflect on and lots of challenges in the political mission of the country and of those that we attempt to serve. So just want to also flag up that we will have some continuations of this series on the 24th of March. We will be joined by Claire Daly, MEP, followed by Rose Conway-Walsh of Sinn Féin on April the 16th, and Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald at an unconfirmed date to come. There's also the lunchtime series with Peadar Kirby on contemporary political crises and transforming market society in an era of climate change. So that's a lunchtime seminar to look out for as well. In welcoming Deputy Murphy this morning, I'm particularly delighted to say that of the political leaders and policymakers that we are welcoming here, she is the only one who is a former board member of TASC. So in a way, she's coming home today. I have told her that that may not necessarily be reflected in the warmth of all the questioning, but we're very much looking forward to an open and I suppose free-flowing discussion after her initial address. Deputy Murphy has given us a number of themes which speak directly to the heart of the challenges facing government and society today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Deputy Murphy, the Deputy for Kildare North and co-founder and joint leader of the Social Democrats.
Thanks very much, Joe, and hi everyone. I'm delighted to have been asked to contribute. I know the work of TASC very well. I've still got some of your publications on my shelf here, very good reference points. Obviously, you know, glad to be taking part in the event today, and it's a pity we obviously can't do it in person. You know, that human interaction is something we're all missing. So hopefully this time next year, that will have changed. If there's an upside, and I'm looking for upsides in COVID, being somebody with a glass half full, I think there's a greater understanding, public understanding of the risks of investing in critical services such as ICU beds, public health. You know, the fact we haven't got smaller class sizes, commodifying care such as childcare, elder care, and indeed care for people with disabilities. I think people are much more aware of the need to invest and develop good public services. And they're also aware in a way they weren't before of just exactly who are the frontline workers. And we're all obviously critically aware of people in healthcare and the amazing job that they have done putting themselves at risk, but also that frontline workers are people who work in our shops. You know, they drive our buses, they empty our bins, and they can also see how those people are rewarded for their work. I think COVID has made people as well reevaluate what they believe to be important. And I think family, friends, you know, solid local communities, you know, safe places to walk or to exercise, you know, all of a sudden have become much more important. And time, I think people have become more acutely aware of the importance of time and how they spend it. And they don't miss the traffic jams, possibility of hybrid working from home and from an office, for example, suddenly has been is something that could become a reality. So I think there are changes on foot as a consequence. I think real choices come with can only be made when there are some certainties. And I think housing policy is one of those central aspects that needs to be grappled with. We've taken a market-led approach to delivering of housing, and it's seen as property, it's seen as a commodity rather than a basic human need. And I think we've got to rethink how we see housing. We need to rethink how affordable housing can be delivered, including reducing the cost of building land, for example, that will require a constitutional amendment. Changing the remit of the Land Development Agency to that of a project management function, where you can get economies of scale, you can possibly bring in a lot of smaller entities and be very efficient and de-risk the financing by creating certainty in relation to how it's project managed. So I think it's possible, and it's a question of political will. Many things in Ireland have got better since I got involved in politics first, and that was in the 1980s. But I think it's fair to say that housing is the one area that has disimproved and substantially. And we remember the Celtic Tiger years and things like, for example, housing being built in inappropriate locations that was ultimately knocked down. So big mistakes, but we have literally created in one generation a housing emergency, and it's particularly acute among young people. Obviously, people are affected in different ways, but I think it's incredible to know that 54% of people between the ages of 18 and 34 now live with their parents, and where that might be all right for an 18-year-old, certainly when you start getting into your mid-20s, early 30s, that removes the possibility of independence for so many of our young adults. When people of their parents' generation bought a house, the cost would be 3 times the average income. It's now 9 or 10 times the average income. So there are real issues to be dealt with there. The cost of housing, impacts on other choices that people make. Time spent with family or friends, and go back to how people have reevaluated. And that feeds into things like childcare, for example. And there's not just one way to address that. For example, a 4-day week is now starting to be favoured, and it certainly shows that people are more productive when they get time off. But it also helps to deal with things like childcare. And a 4-day week may not be possible for everyone now, but it's one that we certainly need to be aspiring to. 100 years ago, can you imagine aspiring to a 5-day week, or being paid for holidays or getting parental leave? We need to position this, at a point in time, perhaps in 10 years, where we reevaluate where work should be, and a 4-day week should certainly be a central part of that. We were locked down. It's just short of 12 months since we were locked down, and we were all in this together. And there was a high degree of social solidarity. We found money for health. We found money for an enhanced social welfare payment through the PUP scheme. We found that we could pay for safety measures in the workplaces and where people publicly interacted. And we put a stay on evictions where people couldn't afford to pay their rent. So social solidarity was needed to crush the virus. And again, just like the financial crash, government reached for the state as opposed to the markets to resolve a big crisis. So social solidarity is something that we need to try and keep and embed, because it opens up so many possibilities. But it can't be achieved on the back of low pay. It can't be achieved on the back of precarious work or impoverished working conditions. Those conditions reinforce inequality. And there's a simple thing that could be done, and that is the right, for example, to give people a right to free collective bargaining. And I think that works in the interests of good employment. We know also that those who suffered most during the pandemic are the ones that could least afford to take the hit. The great irony is that those who were deemed essential, as I've articulated earlier, were the ones that were impacted most. But those who were impacted most were usually women. It's also worth considering the Oxfam report, Time to Care, and most people here will be aware of it. I call it a wealth problem. But you could see that looking at that report, it didn't even land a glove on the wealthiest. COVID didn't even, landed, any kind of a mark on the wealthiest in our society. What it showed was there was, just to remind people, I'd say a lot of people are aware of the report, but 2,153 billionaires, we were told, own more wealth than 4.6 billion people that occupy 60% of our planet. And here in Ireland, there were 17 billionaires identified in the report. And since the pandemic started, they increased their wealth by 3.3 billion. That has to tell you something. So we can't have social solidarity with such vast inequality. We have vast wealth, but there's too many people falling through the cracks, the social safety net. We saw, when the banks were too big to fail, that there was a very quick response and government intervention, inappropriately, I would argue, in some cases. But we haven't seen that same kind of intervention where there are other crises, like, for example, our climate crisis, or, for example, the crisis in homelessness. We need to make sure that they get the position that they need. And that requires public campaigning. It requires a shift in politics as well. If we're going to have a good recovery, what we need to have is we need to have a job-rich recovery, but those jobs have to be good jobs. And where there are, and there will be additional supports needed that are targeted at business, they have to come with caveats. And those caveats are about that we have to see good quality jobs. And we could see, for example, the tax take during the COVID crisis the hit wasn't as bad as was expected. And that was because so many people were low paid workers. And that tells us something. And the hospitality sector is a particular sector that needs to be looked at. Our state has to be bigger, but we have to be careful how that's done. It has to be citizen-centred, and we have to have appropriate checks and balances, and that includes the permanent government. It includes state agencies. There needs to be transparency and accountability, and there has to be value for money. And where people see services designed in that way, that they themselves find easy to navigate, it builds trust in the state. It's very empowering, and it builds confidence in public goods. So where does politics come into this? We need to learn the lessons of COVID and the lessons that the public have learned. And we need to see those changing attitudes, and we need to embrace them. I believe, for example, that the centre is actually centre-left. So we need to stop accepting the political crumbs from the table. Big changes don't happen gradually. They happen because there are big disruptors. For example, the financial crash offered an opportunity that wasn't taken in relation to reforming our public services, because reform became a code for cuts. So this has to be done in a way that brings people with us, but changes are needed. COVID is a huge disruptor, and that disruptor is important in terms of repositioning politics. People know that they were hugely exposed by under-resourcing our healthcare system, and we now have a system that is, or we now have a model, the Sláinte care model, that is adopted by all political parties, but it needs to be delivered, and it needs to be funded and delivered quickly. We need to be solution-based in terms of how we build our public services. They have to be universal. People have to be happy to use them, but they also have to be content that their taxes are being well used to deliver quality services. And public services often are seen as services that are there for people who can't afford to pay privately. We need to get out of that mindset. Everyone I talk to now, whether they're 9 or 90, are talking about the future. That's really rare. People are not stuck in the present. They're not harking back to the past. They're focused on the future. And that's an opportunity that has to be seized. Things like, for example, the urban-rural divide can only be addressed if there are institutional changes in terms of where decisions are made, but also where we use, for example, objective resource allocation to deliver public services, where you don't have a 2-month wait for speech and language therapy in one part of the country and a 2-year wait somewhere else. It can't be that public money is used, as a political slush fund. We have got to do things differently. I think we have a unique opportunity, and I think the public get it. They know there's going to be a tough time ahead, but they also have expectations that are about a different type and a better type of future. And that is one where there's a political intervention, where the state is a stronger state. And that's why I think social democracy is so well placed to deliver a different kind of outcome. And obviously that needs to come with a strong economy. It needs to come, with honest and transparent politics, that people see the checks and balances and can themselves engage in. So that's kind of an outline of how I see how the pandemic has changed the dynamic. And I'm obviously very happy to take questions. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that input, Deputy Murphy, and for being so willing to put yourself under the microscope of the questioning to come. I'll start off with one here, and it's in relation to your central theme of the COVID crisis and how big change is caused by big disruptors, and that this is an opportunity and provides us with a social crossroads, if you like. So you alluded to the role of social solidarity during the crisis. The question is, politically, how do we embed that changed sense of social solidarity? What changes are needed in terms of the political mechanism to make it happen, and how do we pay for it?
Yeah, well, first of all, we've never we've said that the best way to deliver quality public services is that they're universal and that it's paid for through taxation. Very often people are paying anyway. They're paying, by having to have private health insurance, by virtue of the cost of childcare, which people will say that that equates to a second mortgage. So people are paying anyway. The thing about it is, it has been very much the individual as opposed to the collective. And we need to change the mindset from that point of view. If people see a return and they see quality services, we need to. I think you will have an acceptance that they have to be paid for, and there's no other way of doing it other than through direct taxation, where people pay according to their means. And I think that has to go across the spectrum, and including the corporate sector as much as the individual. In terms of how you embed it, I just think you can see that there is a political change even since the general election. You can see opinion polls that there is a shift, and indeed we're finding through the growth in our membership that there is a desire to shape the future. But I don't think you're going to shape it with the old model of politics that is about outsourcing, and it's about there being a smaller state. It has to be a bigger state. So the politics has to change. And that politics is more centre-left politics. And that's where the centre ground is now.
A related question, Deputy, is what are your views and the party's views in relation to universal basic income?
Yeah, I think there's mixed. We've had a bit of a debate on this, and there are people who are, absolutely convinced that that is the way that we should go. It's the more we've looked into it, the less straightforward it is. And I would say our views are certainly still being crystallized in relation to that. And I'd be less than honest if I was to say anything other than that. But there are strong views within the party on it being a really progressive move. But it's not straightforward, and it's important to say that.
What process have you within the party to try and advance that question and to resolve it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially it will be down to, we're doing a bit of research ourselves, and essentially what we will do is we'll have engagement with the various branches and look to where the evidence is. We tend to revert back to, we call ourselves an evidence-based party, so we are going to revert back to the evidence and see where it works. I mean, there's some interesting things being said in relation to, for example, particular sectors, like, for example, the arts would be an area, and it may well be that instead of geographic areas to trial something like this, sectors like the arts, who are, very often people think that, people can survive on the applause that they get, for a performance or something, but you have to put food on the table, and I think that's one particular area that is very precarious, but where I think there's good work could be done there, and a good example could be used to develop that, and I think that is something that's very much in the mix at the moment.
Thank you, Deputy. So keeping on the party political front for a moment, and you're, I suppose, coming off the back of the conference, and you alluded to the growth in the membership. Can I ask a direct question that's come in here? Are the Social Democrats a party of power, and can they be a party of power? Michael McDowell was fond of telling voters that their key question was who they were going to put in as the second party in government rather than the main party, that they had greater influence. What is the Social Democrats' ambition at this point?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think I used the analogy during the general election that essentially you can't have a train that's going in two directions at the same time. As long as the direction of government is such that it would deliver a broadly social democratic, interventionist, larger state outcome, we're interested in being in government. Small parties tend to be, and particularly parties that are, for example, have different underlying philosophy, as we would have, for example, with Fine Gael. If you mix those two parties, what happens is it's not just that you're getting crumbs from the table, but you're operating within an alien philosophy. And so long as the direction of government is going to deliver the kind of outcomes that we aspire to, we're absolutely interested in being involved in a government. That didn't prove to be the case with the mix that we currently have, and we did give it some consideration during the discussions on government. You also have to be of sufficient size that you can deliver, and we have an ambition to deliver, a lot more seats than we did, and we had a really good general election. But we will need to do that to have the kind of clout that would be sufficient to deliver a return in terms of seeing the change that people will have voted for.
Can you put a figure on that?
Well, we're saying that we were looking to treble our seats, and that is a tall order, but we think that is achievable.
Okay, thank you for that. So in seeking to have that kind of political influence or governmental influence, I note quote from your joint leader, Deputy Shortall, at the weekend: Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are content to have an arm's length relationship with public services, abdicating responsibility for providing them. They have this warped view that public services are just for those who can't afford to pay for them. And she contrasts that with the social democratic view of the world. How do you sell that in a political context, in a potential coalition talks context?
I mean, essentially, I think that it depends on your size to start with. It depends on who you would coalesce with, and how if there is a symmetry with that. I think you can't overpromise and underachieve. I think you're better off doing a small number of things and doing them well, so that people can see an outcome from that. And essentially, that would be things like housing, that would be healthcare, it would be the big items that make a substantial difference in people's lives.
So on his recent webinar with us, Deputy Leo Varadkar, our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, advocated somebody to mute themselves there. When the Taoiseach was with us a couple of weeks ago, he was pressed by our convener on the day, Kevin Cardiff, about the impacts of his political philosophy and what it had delivered for the country. And I suppose in an honest evaluation of that approach, the Taoiseach outlined that intergenerational lack of mobility and a deep transformational effect, even in an era of reduced poverty or reduced risk of poverty indices, was still hard to achieve. So there's this notion of fundamental change rather than tinkering around the edges. How does the social democratic approach differ, and how would it be able to achieve that deep change?
Yeah, I think first of all, there's an enormous ship to turn around, but I think there are some basic things that are absolutely essential, and I think that there's, for example, in the workplace, I think there's an acceptance that there requires to be people to negotiate with, and I do think that people being organised in the workplace is going to be important if you're going to deal with the issue of better quality jobs. And we saw, for example, and it's a very good example, we saw, for example, the beef plan movement. Nobody could negotiate with them because they didn't know what they wanted. And I think that was seen as something that poses a risk. And I think there's an appreciation of that. And I think that there would be people within, for example, the business community who would not be enamored with the precariousness of some of the jobs that we're seeing. And unless we grapple with that, we actually reduce people's choices over and above what they had even 10 years ago. Because I think there's a generation that are more impacted, and that's about the working conditions, that's about where people live, their ability to live independently. All of that is central. The Social Democrats take a interventionist approach, and if you look at countries, for example, like the Nordic countries, where there is a good quality universal public services. And if you start looking at the level of inequality, it's less in those countries. And those countries do better. And I think the Spirit level would have, the publication would have shown just how important it is to get that right. I also think that the public attitudes have changed so substantially with COVID that people themselves see it now as a risk not to build systems like a health system that work, that protect them when they need to be protected. And I do think that, for example, people have evaluated or reevaluated what's important So I think that change in mindset will help to change the politics. And I think the politics will need to change the system.
Thank you. I want to internationalize for a moment, if you don't mind. There's a couple of questions in related. Do you think the decline in European social democracy's support in recent years has been because its leadership has lost its way? And what do Social Democrats need to do to recover its support in Europe?
Yeah, I think that's not an unfair question, and there our observation, and there's been some awful examples. The thing about it is that it does require people to have confidence in the people who lead and the political systems, and that there are the appropriate checks and balances. I do think COVID is going to have an impact in most countries across Europe, but I think that there are some countries that are. Look, I mean, essentially, it's fair to say that there are different versions of social democracy as well, and I think that we have seen models that have, high levels of of intervention, and then we've seen other outsourcing of responsibility. I actually think you have to have the checks and balances in place, and that just goes across the spectrum, not just politics, but with state agencies as well, where you have the checks and balances to keep whatever government in power in check, and the citizens have to have a direct opportunity to intervene.
Great. Well, our questions are starting to, the tide is starting to flow very freely, and there is a variety of questions coming in, and trying to group them together. So I'll move on to the issue of cost. There's a number of direct questions on this. One, should the Social Democrats talk more about the cost of policies? A related question, would you agree that the progressive agenda is being discredited by opportunism, whereby every single proposal is condemned if it has any downside whatsoever cost-wise, and there is a tendency to pretend that we can have it all and have it immediately? And the direct question arising then is, would you agree that the centre-left stroke the anti-left, a new grouping, needs to prioritize its aims and be honest about their cost and policy implications?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you're realistic, and that what can be done is narrowed down to what is achievable within time. Within time durations. For example, like it takes a big effort to turn around the like of our health system. I think COVID is going to accelerate that. And I think we've seen some things that have probably been underreported in relation to the HSE and the use of technology, for example, that are very good signs. Yes, there is a degree of populism in relation to in relation to our politics at the moment, that we can abolish a whole lot of different taxes and at the same time deliver public services. That isn't possible. You do require taxes to deliver public service. And I find on the doorstep when people will say to me, like, oh, you want us to pay for this and you want us to pay for that. And then you start saying, well, so what if I was to tell you, if you paid those taxes, that you wouldn't be worried about paying the fees for your children in university? Well, what if I was to say to you that, you wouldn't have to, have private health insurance, or, your childcare wouldn't be a second mortgage? What would your attitude be then? I think how we present what is possible within a timeline that is achievable is important in terms of public expectations. And those public expectations do have to be managed.
Specifically on the third level question there, what is the Social Democrats' position in relation to funding of third level and fees for students?
Yeah, well, I mean, the third level sector is under serious it's under serious it's in serious trouble in relation to funding, and indeed a lot of the international students have been pivotal in terms of managing to keep some of the universities afloat. But fundamentally, education has to be seen as a public good, and we would see that as being something that appropriately falls within the tax system. But it is how you tax people. We wouldn't be adverse, for example, to a third tax rate, a higher tax rate. And so essentially, it's not that and as I said, I do think that the sector that gains most from education, that is the corporate sector, has got to see a value in that education and has got to contribute to it. So, that's how we would see that being paid.
So wouldn't be averse to a third tax rate. Is that policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues that we're working on at the moment, and we had a bit of a discussion about it at our conference, and there was a motion passed on that on Friday or Saturday. And that is one of the pieces of work that we'll be doing something on, because we do accept that you have to say how you're going to pay for things. If you're going to say that they're needed and that you will advocate for them to be delivered in the context of negotiating for a programme for government.
So what would that third tax rate look like, and how does it fit in with USC and PRSI in your considerations?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really, we're at the early stages of developing that. But I mean, the discussion about amalgamating, I mean, I remember when pay-related social insurance was introduced, it was introduced with some guarantees. Those guarantees quickly fell away. We know the universal social charge was really introduced as a mechanism to pay back the national debt in the context of financial crash. There is now a discussion to amalgamate the two of those, and that is, there was a promise in not the last election, but the election before by Fine Gael that they would abolish universal social charge. That is in theory abolishing it, but in actual fact, it's in theory one thing, but in practice it's not. I do think we're going to have to talk about our pay-related social insurance system. We have a whole load of people who are, who don't contribute towards a pension system. I think we have to look at that in the context of making sure that there is sufficient there, and that does require it to be expanded. And I think so there's a number of things that need to be looked at in the context of the taxation system, but social insurance is obviously a different component of that. And as we know, we pay as we go, as opposed to having a reserve, because that reserve was used in the context of the financial crash. So there isn't that reserve fund, and we do know that there is a ticking time bomb there. So that has to be dealt with separately. But I don't see a mechanism for abolishing, for example, the universal social charge. It would cost somewhere in the region of €4 billion. But the thing about it is that it can't be called pay-related social insurance either. And I think that there's a piece of work to be done in educating people about what happened, what was the cost, and what are the opportunities.
So on a related matter in relation to the state pension, so the various parties, I suppose this issue was raised well into the last election campaign, sending parties to dance and dither around the place and react. After a period of reflection on that and the funding that is required, where does the party sit in terms of state pension age?
Yeah, like at the time we met with the unions, we had a look at the numbers on it, and we did a piece of research ourselves. We didn't think, we thought that the Stop 67 campaign, we were concerned about our ability to actually fund that. We went as far as 66. We felt that there was a cutoff there that was achievable, but we didn't think going beyond that was achievable. And I think we've got to be realistic about, because we have a wealth kind of shift in the country where, if you start looking in terms of social solidarity, you start looking at what groups are most exposed. The groups that are most exposed are that younger age cohort who can't afford housing, you can't afford independent living. You can't have a scenario where you will ask them to pay for a change that would be that is something that simply they can't. It's a burden they simply can't bear. So I think we've got to look at it in that context. And again, I think there needs to be an honest debate on that about what is achievable. We know people are living longer. We know that there is a cost in that. But so that has to be factored into the pension age.
So just moving to some of the very direct and concrete questions that we have, I'll just go through them. Why is the Children's Hospital using the same cladding as Grenfell? I've no background information on that, but is that...
No, I actually asked that very question at the Public Accounts Committee, and we were given an assurance that that was not the case. If somebody has evidence to the converse, we talked to the organisation that are actually charged with constructing the hospital, and they told us that they thoroughly went through that in advance of commencing construction. But if there is information to the contrary, I'd be happy to hear it.
The 4-day week has piqued a bit of interest. Can you tell us more of your thoughts on that, how it will be achieved, how it would work?
Yeah, in actual fact, it's there's quite a bit of evidence that actually that increases productivity, to have people who are in the workplace that are fresher, that will really be focused on the time that they're there. And that 4-day week seems to be producing quite a bit of evidence that it actually produces a productivity dividend. Now, it won't be every workplace where that's possible. You can imagine a small shop with with one employee, or you can look at public services. It wouldn't come without a cost, but it's one that we need to aspire to. And I do think that there's going to be substantial changes in the workplace, and I think hybrid working in where people can do that, and where we can actually deal with things like, for example, reducing the impact on the environment by virtue of reducing the need to move around as much. I think there are going to be things like that, but I certainly think 4-day week is something that is very much on the agenda. I think it's on employers' agenda as well.
Yeah, where do you stand then on the issue of a right to disconnect?
Yeah, I really should say we should practice what we preach, and I'm appalling at it myself. But I think that becomes more a conundrum when you have home working, and we saw some pretty awful stuff during the pandemic, where people were being supervised remotely and and expected to operate in maybe in bedrooms where they didn't have a proper desk and things like that. I think we are going to have to get to grips with, if we're going to have a hybrid system, that you have to put checks and balances in, and a right to disconnect has to be part of that.
Is it achievable?
Everything is achievable if you have the political will to do it. Of course it's achievable, but I think that you can see that there are financial benefits, and that often drives these things. The cost of office accommodation, the cost of heating, the cost of all of the things that go with that are factored in when people are considering, when businesses are considering mixing the options. But if you start looking at workplaces where people have a different kind of work environment, where they can move away, they can sit, they can relax. In actual fact, very often people will for example, will come up with better ideas, will be fresher, will be more enthusiastic about the work if the workplace is more conducive. And I think that it's a question of doing this in consultation rather than by imposition.
Thanks very much. Before our next question, just like to remind the audience that we're at 11:45, so we're probably about 10 minutes from wrapping up. So anybody that does want to get a question in and hasn't done it, if you get it into the chat box, we'll try and get it included before the end. So you've on several occasions, Deputy, you've alluded to the difficulties that younger people have in accessing housing, and some of the, I suppose, disproportionate impacts that COVID has had on certain social cohorts. Direct question coming in relation to that: what does the Deputy think can be done to promote job opportunities for young people, considering how badly they have been affected in both their education and employment status by the pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, obviously it's difficult to evaluate that when you're in a lockdown, because obviously job opportunities are going to be limited in that kind of an environment. But you can see who is most impacted by it. And, you know, there are particular sectors, but there are particular age cohorts. And I do think that that is where the recovery needs to really focus. It has to be a job-rich growth. And if we're going to continue putting investment, for example, and we will require, you know, to not lose viable businesses because there requires to be some intervention, but it has to come with a caveat. That intervention requires, you know, on the other side, a quality employment. And I think that, you know, obviously there's been some good work done in terms of some of the educational opportunities that have been offered in the context of the jobs that won't be recovered. And I acknowledge that that has been something that has been offered by this government. But there have been some good initiatives in terms of further education, and particularly more education and training. There have been initiatives in relation to 1-year courses to retrain, and there will be some of the jobs that won't return, and they're the ones that we need to be quite systematic about. What are the sectors that are most exposed? Where should we put the intervention? If there's limited resources, those resources have to be carefully selected. And they have to be selected in a way where you do get that job-rich recovery.
Do you see scope, therefore, for an expanded Springboard program, for instance?
Yeah, I think there is, because I think this is going to take time to to recover. And I think that people have to be given opportunities that are viable opportunities for things that they want to do, where there's a viable future for them. And it's an opportunity to scale up, but there sometimes requires other supports as well. Sometimes people can't take those opportunities because, you know, they may well have a young family. They may well, the income may well, not be sufficient to make the choices that they need to make. So I think that we've got to be imaginative in the kind of supports that are put in place. And like, for example, if you're on a full-time course and you're on a housing assistance payment, you get knocked off that payment. We may need to invest in a different way. What's the point in having somebody sit at home looking for jobs that are not there, where they could be meaningfully engaged in something that gives them a better chance of a more viable future, with a better income.
Our national employment services are largely geared at those that are eligible for a welfare payment, rather than those who may fall into other cohorts, such as women returning to work, carers returning. Do we need to expand our employment services to give service to all of those that may be seeking employment or seeking to move employment as a result of the very fundamentally changed type of jobs that are needed in our economy?
Yeah, I mean, I've been quite critical that there's, in many ways, there's a whole cohort of people who are unemployed or underemployed that we never count. We never count them because they don't fall within that welfare category. And at the same time, there are people within that cohort that want to make a contribution, but do need some supports to get to the point where they can make that contribution. I don't think it may well be a subset of that group, but it certainly, I think we have to look wider than we have done to date. But I think we need to know what's possible in relation to job opportunities. Education, I've always felt, for example, is not just about jobs. It is about something bigger than that. But I do think at the same time, we do have to tailor where there is going to be work around, where the supports are put in place. And I've been quite critical on some of the things that have been put in place, because I've been hearing from people who've been very dissatisfied by some of the initiatives. I can't recall the name of the
Is it Job Path you're referring to?
Job Path is the very one. And you will hear from people mainly that are dissatisfied. And I've no doubt that there are people who are satisfied with it. But too often I've heard from people who are being told that, yes, there are jobs, but their jobs are in security and the jobs are in hospitality. And essentially it's bringing people into a room, asking them to do what they could do at home by going through, websites in relation to what jobs are available. It's more about, well, there's certainly a cohort of people who feel that it's more about, almost saying that they don't want to work. And I think that there are better ways of doing that. And like, for example, there were good initiatives that have been dispensed with where person was looked at and the person's need was looked at in relation to the kind of upskilling that was required, as opposed to that type of approach.
Very good. On international competitiveness in terms of a recovery, I suppose we're in a changed situation in that the valve of emigration is not there, whereas it may have been there before. Where sits Ireland now in terms of how its competitiveness can respond to COVID? You saw it as a disruptor. What are the opportunities for Ireland post-COVID?
I would say that one of the key areas is the area of housing. It drives up wage demands, and it drives up the cost base of doing business, because people, obviously, it's the one area that impacts on an individual or a family budget most is the cost of housing. You will not get your cost base right as long as your housing is unaffordable. That is critically important, and I don't think it's been treated in that kind of a way. As there's been an outsourcing of the responsibility rather than delivering directly, and we can see that where you can deliver houses that are affordable, the direct build is by far the way to deliver greater affordability. But there's other ways of doing it. As I said, the Land Development Agency, where you get economies of scale. I think that housing is critical. But there are other things like, the insurance, for example, is a driver. But it's things that are kind of are secondary to wages that are very often what drives your cost base. And I think that they're things that we could meaningfully work on at this point and make a difference.
You represent, I suppose, a commuter belt constituency that has very fundamentally changed in terms of its population size and its makeup over the last 2 decades. Do you see opportunities and challenges? What challenges are there, and how would you meet them in regard to the increased likelihood of remote working, and how that might affect our employment policy and our attraction of foreign direct investment, now that not everybody needs to sit in a 500 or 1,000 seater centre in Dublin 2?
Yeah, I mean, it's precisely areas like the area I represent. And when you look at the statistics on it, there are now more people living in the counties, the combined counties of Meath, Kildare and Wicklow, than live in Dublin city centre, Dublin city itself. That's an incredible shift. We haven't got the population balance right. I remember being involved in the Dublin Transportation Initiative, and they did scenario testing about where we should, where we should grow. And it's the converse of what we have seen since that initiative was launched in the early 90s. We're seeing now where there's an aim to get balanced regional development in cities like Limerick, like Cork and Galway, and I think that's going to be needed. But there is going to be, and people are seeing now the opportunity of working from home at least part of the week, and I think that obviously benefits everyone, because you actually scale down the number of people that are on the move, and obviously that has another benefit in terms of our climate obligations. But it will be areas like mine that will be positively impacted by that kind of a hybrid change in the workplace.
Just coming to our final section, Deputy, as you know, our audience is quite politically engaged, and the questioning is now starting to come down to that political engagement and positioning. You stated that in your conference address that the Social Democrats were looking beyond the next election and looking to the next generation. But can you give me your political priorities for the next 18 months?
Ooh, 18 months depends very much if there's, well, our political priorities will be to build our party, to get our candidates in position as a party, so as that we can contest both the local and the general election and European election in terms of growing the party and capitalising on the not for the sake of growing the party in itself, because it has because we feel that it's essential to delivering a different type of outcome. So, I mean, that will be a priority for us. But also in doing that, we'll be developing policies, including costing them, about what is achievable, so as that we'll know what our demands will be in the context of negotiating for a programme for government that we can deliver on. But I think it is important, when you talk about expectations, to talk about the next generation, because there are things that can't be delivered in 18 months, that can't be delivered in the lifetime of one government, and where it may well be that there's increments, or it's delivered in increments. It's not incremental delivery, or it's where you need to have the outline of the plan, where you're going, and deliver it in increments, rather than fragmentation and not delivering something cohesive at the end. So it's being thought out, being focused on a small number of really key areas that people can see that different politics actually do deliver different outcomes.
So if those 18 months brought you to the cusp of a programme for government negotiation, what would be achievable, do you think, in that first programme for government?
Well, I would want to see the full delivery of Sláinte Care to start with. I think, I think that is possible within that timeline. And we can't continue to be exposed in the way we are. And I think that is certainly deliverable, and I think it'll have public support. I think on housing, we have to get to grips with affordability and delivering the kind of numbers that we need in the locations that we need. I think areas like, for example, childcare I think we do have to start making a meaningful change in relation to delivering on a childcare system that is child-centered. It's but that it balances it balances things like, for example, the time people have available themselves, and that brings in the like of the 4-day week as an objective. I think making a start on a serious start on workers' rights has got to be, including the right to free collective bargaining, and the changing nature of work has got to be something that you would be expecting to see in a programme for government that we'd be involved in.
Final question. As you know, they're all political junkies out there. The question has come in directly and indirectly and in various different ways, but I'll give it directly. Should Labour and the Social Democrats merge?
No. Actually, I think that it's it really annoys me that when you start looking at things like, for example, bringing new people into politics, different choices actually bring new people into politics. I have no problem with the Labour Party existing in its own right. We should be permitted to exist in our own right, and beyond question. Like, for example, we're constantly told you can't get women involved in politics. Well, we didn't find that was a problem because we didn't have an incumbency issue. And in fact, more political parties is what we need, not less. And I have no desire to put energy into something. And if you look at, for example, if you start looking at things like, and I was involved in the merger very reluctantly, I've got to say, between DL and the Labour Party. And we were told constantly it would be greater than the sum of the two parts, and it wasn't. So a bit of competition is no harm, keeps us all on our toes. And the more political options, the more choice you have, the more engaged the public will be.
Thank you very much for your direct and very direct answer to that question, and for your outlining of the remaining parts of the political choices before the party and the country and society today. That concludes our latest TASC conversation with the decision maker, Deputy Catherine Murphy. I thank the Deputy for her time and input, and I thank you all for your questions and attendance today. I think John will be making the recording available perhaps on Facebook afterwards, and if there's any supplementary questions, they can be fed through TASC as well. So that concludes our proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.